The rain hammered against the library windows as Marcus stared at the leather-bound volume before him. The words of Niccolò Machiavelli seemed to leap from the yellowed pages, each sentence a dagger thrust into his comfortable illusions. For months, he had been drifting through life like a ship without anchor, allowing circumstances to dictate his direction, permitting others to define his worth. But, tonight, something had shifted. Tonight, he would begin the most crucial battle of his life, the war against his own weakness. The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him, Machiavelli had written. Marcus closed his eyes and considered the people in his orbit. Complainers, excuse-makers, those who celebrated mediocrity and dressed their failures in the clothes of virtue. He had become one of them, and the realization struck him like a physical blow. The transformation would not be gentle. Real change never is. It would require the systematic destruction of every soft habit, every comfortable lie, every excuse that had allowed him to remain less than what he could become. This was not about self-improvement in the gentle, therapeutic sense that modern culture promotes. This was about the forging of an entirely new being from the fire of disciplined will. Part 1, The Foundation of Iron. The first morning arrived with the persistence of an enemy siege. At 4:30 a.m., when the world still wrapped itself in darkness and silence, Marcus forced his body from the warmth of sleep. Every fiber of his being protested. The weak self that had controlled him for so long whispered seductive promises of just 5 more minutes and starting tomorrow instead. But he had made a pact with iron discipline, and iron does not bend to comfort. Machiavelli understood that power begins with self-mastery. A prince who cannot govern his own desires will never effectively govern others. The same principle applies to anyone seeking to transform their life. You cannot command respect from the world if you cannot command respect from yourself. Every small victory over comfort, every moment where discipline conquers impulse, builds the foundation upon which all future strength rests. The cold shower that followed was a declaration of war against the soft life that had been slowly killing his potential. As the icy water shocked his system awake, he felt something primal stirring within him, the recognition that he was no longer the same person who had gone to sleep the night before. The man emerging from this water would not negotiate with weakness, would not compromise with mediocrity, would not accept the limitations that others tried to impose upon him. Physical training came next, and here the philosophy of Machiavelli merged with the ancient wisdom of warriors. The body is the first territory that must be conquered and governed. Every push-up executed with perfect form was a victory over the voice that said good enough. Every additional repetition beyond the point of comfort was a step further away from the weak self that would settle for less than excellence. The gym at this hour belonged to a different breed of people. These were the ones who had declared war on ordinary. They understood what Marcus was beginning to learn, that the battle for an extraordinary life is won or lost in the moments when no one is watching, when the only witness to your commitment is the mirror and your own conscience. Between sets, he reflected on Machiavelli's insight that men judge more by appearances than reality. This was not an endorsement of deception, but a recognition of human nature. The way you carry yourself, the energy you project, the standards you visibly maintain, these communicate your value to the world before you speak a single word. A man who has conquered his physical realm sends an unmistakable message that he is not to be underestimated or overlooked. The nutrition protocol he established was equally unforgiving. Gone were the convenient excuses about not having time to prepare proper meals. Every piece of food that entered his body would serve a purpose, fuel the transformation, support the goal. This was not about following the latest diet trend but about taking complete ownership of one of the most fundamental aspects of human existence. Preparation became a ritual, each meal planned and executed with military precision. The weak self had always chosen convenience over quality, immediate gratification over long-term benefit. But the emerging self understood that every choice was either moving him toward his vision or away from it. There was no neutral ground in the battle for transformation. As the first day progressed, he noticed something remarkable happening in his interactions with others. The energy of a man who has begun to take control of his life is unmistakable. Colleagues who had previously dismissed him found themselves listening more carefully to his words. The certainty that comes from self-discipline creates a gravitational field that draws respect and attention. But Machiavelli warned against the dangers of appearing too virtuous, too perfect. Real strength reveals itself not in the absence of struggle but in the mastery of it. He began to understand that true dominance comes not from hiding your efforts but from making them appear effortless. The hours of preparation, the sacrifices made in private, the daily battles won against weakness, these should remain largely invisible while their effects become undeniable. The evening reflection period became a crucial component of the transformation. Machiavelli spent his evenings in deep contemplation and study, recognizing that the mind requires the same disciplined attention as the body. Marcus established a practice of reviewing each day's victories and defeats with the cold objectivity of a general analyzing a battlefield. Where had he allowed softness to creep in? What opportunities for growth had he missed? What patterns of thought or behavior were still serving the weak self rather than the emerging strong self? This was not the gentle self-reflection promoted by modern wellness culture, but a harsh audit conducted by a man serious about change. The reading list he compiled drew heavily from those who had mastered the art of self-transformation. Machiavelli's complete works, certainly, but also Marcus Aurelius, Sun Tzu, Miyamoto Musashi, and other figures who understood that life is warfare and victory goes to those who prepare most thoroughly. Each book became a weapon in the arsenal of the mind, each insight a tool for dismantling the architecture of weakness. Sleep, too, became a disciplined practice rather than a passive surrender to exhaustion. The bedroom was stripped of distractions, the environment optimized for recovery and regeneration. Even in rest, he was training his body to repair itself efficiently, training his mind to process the day's learning, training his spirit to wake refreshed and ready for the next day's battles. The first day ended with a sense of profound shift. Nothing dramatic had occurred in the external world, but, internally, a revolution had begun. The weak self was already beginning to starve from lack of attention and indulgence. In its place, something harder and more purposeful was taking shape. This was just the foundation. The real test would come as the days progressed and the initial enthusiasm met the inevitable resistance that emerges when old patterns fight for survival. But, for tonight, he had won the first battle. Tomorrow, the war would continue. Part 2, The Alchemy of Focus. The second phase of transformation revealed itself like dawn breaking over a battlefield. Marcus had spent the first segment of his journey establishing the physical infrastructure of discipline, the early rising, the training, the nutritional precision. Now came the more subtle but equally crucial work of forging an unbreakable focus, the kind of mental clarity that Machiavelli himself possessed when he analyzed the political landscape of Renaissance Italy with surgical precision. Focus, he was learning, was not merely about concentration. It was about the ruthless elimination of everything that did not serve the mission. The weak self had been scattered, reactive, allowing every notification, every impulse, every social obligation to fragment his attention into useless pieces. The emerging self would be different, laser-focused, intentional, capable of sustained effort toward meaningful objectives. The digital purge began at dawn on the fourth day. Every app that served no purpose beyond entertainment or distraction was deleted without ceremony. Social media platforms that had once consumed hours of his attention were abandoned like a general abandoning indefensible territory. The phone itself was relegated to a tool rather than a companion, checked at designated times rather than carried as a constant source of stimulation. This was not digital minimalism for its own sake but the application of Machiavellian strategy to the modern attention economy. Every company, every platform, every creator was fighting for his mental resources. To surrender his attention freely was to remain weak, controlled by forces external to his will. To guard it jealously was to maintain sovereignty over his own mind. The workspace underwent a similar transformation. Every surface was cleared except for the materials directly relevant to his highest priorities. The visual field became a reflection of mental clarity, clean, organized, purposeful. Clutter in the environment breeds clutter in the mind, and a man serious about transformation cannot afford either. But the real work of focus happened in the realm of decision-making. Machiavelli understood that a prince must make clear choices, often between competing goods, and that the ability to choose decisively is more valuable than choosing perfectly. The weak self had always wanted to keep all options open, to avoid the discomfort of closing doors. The emerging self learned to cut ruthlessly, to say no to good opportunities in service of great ones. Project selection became an exercise in strategic thinking. Every potential commitment was evaluated through a simple filter. Does this move me closer to becoming the man I am committed to becoming, or does it merely feel urgent? The vast majority of opportunities, he discovered, fell into the latter category, distractions disguised as priorities, busy work masquerading as productivity. The few projects that passed this filter received the full force of his concentrated attention. Here, he applied another principle from Machiavelli: better to do a few things excellently than many things adequately. Excellence in a focused area creates a reputation and momentum that mediocrity across many areas never can. The morning planning ritual became sacred. Before any external input was allowed to influence his day, he would spend 30 minutes in complete clarity about what would be accomplished and why. This was not the loose goal setting of the weak self but military-level precision in defining objectives, resources, and success metrics. Each task was approached with what he came to think of as the Machiavellian mindset, a combination of grand vision and minute attention to detail. Machiavelli could envision the unification of Italy while simultaneously calculating the precise diplomatic steps needed to achieve it. Similarly, Marcus learned to hold both the long-term transformation he was pursuing and the specific actions required in each moment. Interruptions became enemies to be defeated rather than visitors to be welcomed. The weak self had always prided itself on being flexible and responsive, but these virtues were actually disguised weakness and inability to defend one's priorities against the agenda of others. The emerging self learned the power of the closed door, the unmonitored phone, the scheduled unavailability. This required developing what Machiavelli would have recognized as political skill, the ability to maintain relationships while defending boundaries. People who had grown accustomed to his constant availability initially resisted his new standards. But resistance, he learned, was often a sign that the change was working. Those who respected strength adapted quickly to his new boundaries. Those who had been exploiting his weakness revealed themselves and were accordingly managed. The quality of his thinking began to shift as mental resources previously scattered across dozens of trivial concerns became available for deeper work. Problems that had once seemed overwhelming could be approached with sustained attention. Creative insights that required extended periods of uninterrupted thought began to emerge regularly. Reading, too, became a focused discipline rather than a passive consumption activity. Each book was approached with specific questions and objectives. Key insights were immediately applied rather than merely appreciated. The gap between learning and implementation, which had previously been measured in months or years, compressed to days or hours. The evening review expanded to include not just what had been accomplished, but how effectively attention had been deployed. Where had focus been lost? What patterns were emerging in the things that derailed concentration? What environmental or procedural changes would make tomorrow's focus more effective? Sleep quality improved dramatically as the mind learned to truly rest rather than continuing to process the random inputs that had previously filled each day. Dreams became more vivid and purposeful, as if the subconscious was finally receiving clear signals about what deserved its attention. By the end of the fifth day, something remarkable had occurred. The sensation of being scattered, reactive, and overwhelmed had been replaced by a feeling of purposeful forward momentum. Each day felt substantial rather than merely busy. Progress was visible and measurable rather than hoped for and assumed. This transformation in focus was already beginning to compound. Better focus led to better results, which created more confidence, which supported even greater focus. The upward spiral that characterizes all successful transformations had begun. But focus without direction is merely intensity without purpose. The final phase would require marrying this newfound mental clarity to a strategic vision worthy of the effort being invested. Part 3, The Crown of Strategic Dominance. The final transformation phase arrived like the moment when a master craftsman adds the finishing touches that transform skilled work into art. Marcus had built the foundation of physical discipline and erected the structure of mental focus. Now came the most sophisticated element, the development of strategic thinking that would allow him to not merely respond to circumstances but to shape them according to his will. Machiavelli's greatest insight was that most people are reactive, they respond to events, adapt to circumstances, and hope for favorable outcomes. The truly powerful, however, learn to think several moves ahead, to create situations that serve their purposes, and to position themselves so that even unfavorable circumstances can be turned to advantage. This level of strategic thinking would become the crown jewel of Marcus's transformation. The shift began with a fundamental change in how he viewed time. The weak self had always lived in the immediate present, responding to whatever seemed most urgent. The emerging self learned to think in multiple time horizons simultaneously: what needed to be accomplished today to serve this week's objectives, what needed to happen this week to achieve this month's goals, what needed to be built this month to realize this year's vision. This was not mere planning but strategic architecture. Each daily action was selected not just for its immediate value but for how it positioned him for future opportunities. Each relationship was cultivated not just for present benefit but for how it might serve larger purposes down the line. Each skill developed was chosen for how it would compound with other capabilities to create unique value. The networking approach underwent a complete revolution. Previously, he had engaged with others reactively, responding to invitations, attending whatever events seemed interesting, building relationships based on immediate compatibility. Now, he began to think like Machiavelli analyzed his diplomatic relationships: who were the key players in his field, what did they need, how could he provide value, and how could mutual benefit be structured? But this was not manipulation in the negative sense. True strategic thinking recognizes that sustainable power comes from creating genuine value for others while advancing your own purposes. The most effective alliances are those where all parties benefit substantially from the relationship. Machiavelli understood this when he wrote about the importance of being both feared and loved. Fear without love breeds resentment, but love without respect breeds exploitation. Marcus began to study the power structures in his professional environment with the same analytical intensity that Machiavelli brought to Renaissance politics. Who made the real decisions? What were their motivations and constraints? Where were the opportunities for someone with his emerging capabilities to create value and gain influence? This analysis revealed patterns that had been invisible to his previous, reactive mindset. Certain types of problems consistently emerged that no one was effectively solving. Certain relationships between departments or individuals created friction that someone with the right skills could smooth. Certain opportunities for innovation or improvement were visible but ignored by those too busy with immediate concerns to think strategically. He began positioning himself as the solution to these overlooked problems. But, rather than simply volunteering for additional work, he approached each situation with strategic thinking about how solving this problem would enhance his reputation, expand his capabilities, and create new opportunities. The weak self would have said yes to everything and hoped to be noticed. The emerging self said no to everything except the carefully selected opportunities that would compound into something extraordinary. Each project became a chess move in a larger game, each success a foundation for the next level of challenge. Communication style evolved to reflect this strategic thinking. Rather than simply responding to questions or participating in conversations, he learned to shape discussions toward topics where his insights would be most valuable. Rather than accepting whatever role others assigned to him in meetings or projects, he positioned himself as the person who could see connections others missed, who could propose solutions others hadn't considered. This required developing what Machiavelli would have called political intelligence, the ability to read situations, understand motivations, and position oneself advantageously without appearing manipulative or self-serving. The key insight was that the most powerful position is often that of the person who helps others achieve their goals more effectively. Risk assessment became a constant practice. Every decision was evaluated not just for its potential upside but for how it positioned him if things went wrong. Machiavelli wrote extensively about the importance of having multiple options and never being completely dependent on any single relationship, opportunity, or strategy. Marcus began to structure his professional and personal life accordingly. But perhaps the most profound shift was in how he related to setbacks and obstacles. The weak self had always viewed difficulties as evidence that something was wrong, that circumstances were unfair, that others were to blame. The strategic self began to see obstacles as information, data about what strategies were working, what assumptions needed revision, what new approaches might be more effective. This perspective transformed everything. A project that didn't go as planned became an opportunity to demonstrate grace under pressure and problem-solving capability. A relationship that soured became information about better ways to assess character and compatibility. A goal that proved unrealistic became insight into better goal-setting processes. The compound effect of 7 days of integrated transformation became undeniable. The physical discipline had created energy and presence that others noticed. The mental focus had dramatically improved the quality of his work and decision-making. The strategic thinking was beginning to create opportunities and possibilities that hadn't existed before. But, more importantly, he had fundamentally altered his relationship with himself. The man who had begun this journey had been at the mercy of his impulses, his circumstances, and other people's agendas. The man emerging at the end possessed something far more valuable, the knowledge that he could transform any aspect of himself or his situation through disciplined application of will and intelligence. This was the true meaning of Machiavelli's insight about power, not power over others, but power over oneself. Not the ability to control external circumstances, but the ability to respond to any circumstances in ways that serve your larger purposes. Not the elimination of all obstacles, but the development of capabilities that make obstacles irrelevant. The weak self that had existed 7 days earlier was not reformed or improved, it was destroyed. In its place stood someone who thought differently, acted differently, and related to the world from a position of strength rather than weakness. This was not a temporary change but a fundamental shift in identity, a crossing of a threshold from which there would be no return. The rain that had hammered against the library windows on that first night had long since stopped. Morning light now streamed through the same windows, illuminating a different man reading the same words of Machiavelli. But now those words were no longer philosophical abstractions, they were practical tools in the hands of someone who had proven to himself that transformation is not only possible but inevitable for those willing to pay the price. The battle against weakness had been won not through a single heroic effort but through the accumulated weight of hundreds of small victories, each one building the foundation for the next. The man who destroys his weak self, Machiavelli knew, creates something that cannot be destroyed by others because it is built on the bedrock of discipline rather than the shifting sands of circumstance. This was only the beginning. The 7 days had established the foundation and framework, but the real work, the daily application of these principles to an entire lifetime of challenges and opportunities, lay ahead. Yet Marcus faced the future with the quiet confidence of someone who had proven to himself that he could become whoever he chose to be, accomplish whatever he committed to accomplish, and overcome whatever obstacles stood in his way. The transformation was complete, but the journey had just begun. The man who has learned to govern himself possesses the only kingdom that cannot be conquered, the only wealth that cannot be stolen, the only power that grows stronger through exercise rather than weaker through use. In 7 days, a weak self can be destroyed and a strong self born, but the maintenance of that strength requires the same discipline that created it, applied fresh each day for the rest of one's life.